This is All Out Politics, news, debate and opinion from the heart of Westminster. And the success of the Me Too campaign has shown the power of social media to get a political message across. But has it gone too far? And are we creating a generation of snowflakes? Or do millennials, in fact, hold the current balance of power in politics in 2018? Well, joining me to discuss that are Maya Goodfellow, who's a freelance columnist and a researcher at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and Ella Whelan, who's the assistant editor at Spiked Online and author of What Women Want, Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism. Well, welcome to you both. Ella, I mean, do you get the sense now that the fallout from Harvey Weinstein and Me Too and Time's Up and the rest of it means that your sort of values are now dictating the climate in countries like this?
My values, the fallout from Harvey Weinstein and the ongoing Me Too campaign, I suppose it is dominating discussion. I would be kind of disappointed in that fact because I don't actually see it as a necessarily successful campaign. It's actually very difficult to figure out whether or not it is a movement. It really exists online. People don't have meetings in parish halls about it. There's not a lot of young people sign up to it, actually. It seems to be a kind of...
Me Too itself is a hashtag, perhaps, but the wider sort of readjustment of relationships between the sexes does seem to be underway.
Yes, and I think that's mostly a bad thing. I actually think that what's spun out of the Me Too, dare I say it, sexual harassment panic, has been an encouraging view of women seeing men as potential dangers. There's been new regulations instilled in relation to workplace policies, suggestions of more regulation of people's interaction on the streets. In Nottingham, you've got police criminalising catcalling. There's this kind of growing fear of that men and women can't work out things between each other, which has happened for years, and I think it's really turning out to be largely a bad thing.
Bad thing?
I mean, I think that actually what we need to put this in the particular context. So what we've seen is a lot of women coming forward and talking about the abuse and harassment they've experienced. And there's particular instances where women have tried to come forward in the past and have been shut down. So actually, I think this is something slightly different. I maybe do share some concerns with you that we need very clear demands from these kinds of movements. But actually, I think it's born of a politics that is actually about women not having the right avenues to be able to hold people accountable when they are being harassed, where they are being abused. So I actually think this is slightly more complex than that analysis allows for. But if we're talking about generational power and we're talking about millennials, I actually think if we take the UK as a specific example, it's actually, if we look at the last general election, under 45s, these are people who have consistently actually been told that they're going to have potential opportunities, whether it be housing, whether it be the job market, and whether it be education. And they're actually quite sick of the fact that the promises that were made to them by politicians have not manifested. So if we broaden this out beyond Me Too, I think we can actually have a really interesting conversation about the way the status quo in politics is being challenged by the Labour Party and by Jeremy Corbyn in a really interesting and dynamic way.
Well, I won't come back to that, but I mean, do you think, though, that is true, that this is being challenged? Because the reality is, if you are from a millennial generation, you are going to have problems buying a home.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's...
So they're angry about it, but it's not changing anything, is it?
They're angry about it, and there is this kind of very prevalent discourse in politics that millennials are fed up and they're kind of taking back control of politics, to use that dangerous phrase, and they're kind of running the show, actually, as we've seen recently in relation to the sort of semi-myth of the Labour upsurge and the youth vote, all these kind of things being chatted, that actually we don't have a kind of extremely engaged young millennial set of people who are calling the shots in politics. On the contrary, I think many politicians and members of the political class are relying on the voice of the young because they've lost the argument with lots of the other voters. You know, in the case of Brexit, which is such a fantastic example of the problem with generational war, the generational war in politics, is that you've got such a strong mandate from 17.4 million people, and yet all the political class are talking about what young people want, of whom such a small percentage took part in that referendum. Kind of a bit in danger, I think, just to kind of disagree with you, of fetishising youth and fetishising the kind of youth vote in politics, when actually there's much more important things to talk about. Brexit, housing isn't a generational issue, and it shouldn't be. And I think to make it so is really to divide politics, actually.
Well, is it not a generational issue when you've got 75% of under 25s voting to remain and you've got a similar percentage of over 65s voting to leave? I mean, that is a pretty stark generational division, isn't it?
It would be, yeah, it is. But the point is, not every young person took. We know that not every young person took part in that vote.
Yeah.
And actually, there is, you know, as a young Brexiteer, I really want to challenge the idea that it's a given that all young
but
people
the turnout wasn't bad, though, was it?
It wasn't too bad. But the whole point is, you know, this is, I think, dare I say, a tactic of people who aren't too keen on Brexit to suggest. You had on Sky News recently a young man who's pushing for the rowing back on Brexit, is to position young people as the people who are going to get us away from Brexit, who are going to save us from Brexit. I think most young people would be kind of annoyed by that, actually.
So, I mean, I don't disagree. When I mentioned under 45s, I think that's actually just the reality of who was voting for the Labour Party at the last general election in overwhelming numbers. I agree that this generational divide is not a helpful way to understand politics. It may exist in some forms, but actually I think we need to always be bringing this back to the material. So if you look at austerity, it's women of colour who are going to be hit, who have been hit twice as hard as any other group by austerity. So the Runnymede Trust and the Women's Budget Group have found that by 2020, women of colour will have lost twice as much as poor white men. That's not to say either of those groups should be losing out, but I think actually what we should be doing in a lot of our analysis is bringing together these different forms of oppression, these different groups who are being hit in different ways, and bringing people together under these kind of causes, as opposed to dividing people along these generational lines. So I would agree with you there, but I do think that what we've seen under Jeremy Corbyn and under the Labour Party is a reinvigoration of a politics that challenges the status quo.
I mean, just to take that, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell are old men, for starters, aren't they? They're not millennials, they're not women of colour or anything else like that, first of all. And secondly, if you take the Brexit issue, for example, they are probably much closer to the older generation than most of their young supporters, aren't they?
I don't think that's a particularly fair assessment. I think what's happening with the Labour Party is they've realised that there was a Brexit vote and they are now trying, whilst in opposition, let's remember they're not the ones negotiating Brexit, they are dealing with the circumstances with which we're in. And what they want is the best deal for the country. They don't want us to be plunged into a recession. They don't want people to be losing out once we leave the European Union. They want to ensure that...
I mean, and apple pie as well. I mean, no, I'm just saying in practical terms, are they focusing on the issues that you've raised sufficiently?
Of course. If we look at the last general election, we look at the Labour Party's manifesto, there were substantive policies there to deal with some of the economic circumstances we're in, that successive governments have plunged us into. I think they need to go further, yes, but I do think they're beginning to have some
The main issue of the day is Brexit, and the Labour Party has time and again proven itself to not be able to stand up and give people what they want, and that Brexit is going to define all other areas. Brexit will define housing, it will define immigration, it will define all areas of politics, and the Labour Party are afraid of it, and they should be ashamed of that fact, I think.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed. And some breaking